Hey, Doc Steve here, and I'm an ER doc, and I've been doing these videos on the myths and misconceptions about the coronavirus. And today I want to talk about two medications that have vastly different opinions about them out there, namely hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin. And when I say vastly different opinions here, I mean vastly different. There's actually a group out there that it seems like they think we should draw and quarter anybody who prescribes ivermectin for coronavirus. At the same time, there's a group out there that seems to think we should be popping a hydroxychloroquine every day with our morning coffee. So vastly different. And one of the big questions is, how do we get here? I want to tell you, if I were to tell you right now today, mid-November 2021, whether these medicines actually work for coronavirus, it's actually true that by the time I publish a video, I could be wrong. And that's because medical science changes. It always changes. New data always comes in. And this is one of the reasons I think there's such vastly different opinions about these meds. I think there's others too, but this is one of them. Now, it may surprise some of you folks to know that both of these medicines early on had some evidence that they would work for the coronavirus. For example, ivermectin in the lab in a test tube seemed to have some activity against one of the enzymes that the coronavirus needs to latch onto your cells. So I'm a common sense person, so common sense says, well, it obviously should work, right? Well, not so fast, because it turns out that the concentration you need to hinder that enzyme in the lab is about 100 times what that medicine would get to in your body. So at that point, common sense says, well, it probably shouldn't work, right? Well, not so fast, right? Because I'm not a test tube. You're not a test tube. I don't know anyone who is a test tube. We're much more complicated than that. And that's why studies are necessary. Now, it might surprise some of you folks to know that each of these medicines early on had some studies that showed that they might work for the coronavirus. For example, hydroxy had studies that showed that it worked with some previous coronaviruses and some early evidence that maybe it worked for this one. This was enough for us to actually start using hydroxy early on in the pandemic in the ER. When somebody came in with coronavirus pneumonia, we would actually treat people with this. Now, that didn't last very long. And why is that? You've got studies, so we should have the answer, right? Well, not so fast. And that's because all studies are not created equal. So why do we stop using hydroxy so quickly? By the way, hydroxy is my pet affectionate name for hydroxychloroquine. I call ivermectin Iver. Since we started working on this 2 weeks and we spent so much time together, we're on a first name basis. So in order to explain why we stopped using hydroxy so quickly, I have to explain a little bit about what I meant when I said all studies are not created equal. You see, there's a whole bunch of different kinds of studies. There's cohort studies and case control studies and population studies. And all of these studies are subject to something called scientific bias. And when I say the word bias in this context, I'm not talking about what most of us think about the word bias, as in I'm the person investigating this med and I don't like hydroxychloroquine, so I'm going to make sure it flunks this study. That's not what I'm talking about. Investigator bias is a real thing, but I'm talking about bias that's built into the actual structure of the study, and you can't really avoid it. You can try and minimize it, but you can't avoid it. And bias in a study basically means that you could be asking a question and get an answer that's not true. In other words, the study might show that hydroxychloroquine works for coronavirus, whereas it actually doesn't. Or it might show that Iver doesn't work for coronavirus, but it actually does. That's what bias is. So how do you avoid that? Well, the gold standard of studies is something called a double-blinded, randomized controlled study, and that is a study that has the least potential for bias. And let me just explain real quick what that is. That's where the people who are the volunteers come, and each of the volunteers get randomly placed into one or two groups. Either they're going to get hydroxy when they get the coronavirus disease, or they're going to get a placebo, which is basically a pill that has everything that the hydroxy pill has without the hydroxy. And then they're going to follow both groups, and they're going to see how both groups do with their disease. And the other thing about it, the double-blinded part means that neither the volunteers nor the investigators know who's in which group. And that's the best way to avoid investigator bias. So then you follow the study out, and at the end you unmask who's in each group. You see which group did better with respect to the question you're trying to answer, and then you crunch your numbers. Now, this kind of double-blinded, randomized controlled study is the least likely to give you bias. So it's the least likely to provide you with the wrong answer. But unfortunately, it's also by far the most complicated to do. It takes a lot longer. It is more expensive. And that's why a lot of times we don't get these kind of answers early on when you're looking at a pandemic. So bottom line with this whole discussion, a lot of the easy, quick to do studies have the most potential for bias, therefore the most likely to give you the wrong answer. The ones that take a lot longer, often come later, basically are the best in terms of giving you the right answer. With respect to hydroxychloroquine, early on we started to get some small randomized controlled studies that basically showed it didn't work for coronavirus, especially for sick coronavirus patients. And as time went by, we had more and more of these studies, including some large ones. And actually, there were a couple of studies that showed that you actually did worse in the hydroxychloroquine group, including higher rate of death, which seems kind of crazy. But that might have to do with the fact that hydroxychloroquine actually also has a little deep, dark secret. It's actually not a secret to us medical people, but hydroxychloroquine has a couple of really bad side effects, including death. And I'm talking cardiac arrest, potentially not even like, oh, I feel a little lousy. Maybe I should go to see my doctor or go to the ER. But, oh, I feel a little lousy. Oh, I feel really lousy. In other words, sudden cardiac death. And this is one of the side effects of hydroxychloroquine. Now, there's a second side effect that's kind of nasty with hydroxy as well, and that's permanent blindness. The estimates I've heard for this side effect is 1 in 10,000 patients or so. This is probably more a side effect that has to do with long-term use, but we don't really know because we don't use hydroxy much short-term. But I have to tell you, I don't want a single patient in my entire career to die or to go blind from a medicine I prescribe, especially if it doesn't work for what I'm using it for. Now, in my understanding, there's still some studies, some large studies out there that are looking at a little different clinical question. That's whether you can take hydroxychloroquine to prevent you from getting it after an exposure. In other words, take it prophylactically. Maybe you're in a high-risk profession, or maybe you get exposed to it, and this is to prevent it from establishing an infection. I haven't seen the results of those studies, but in general, for sick COVID, hydroxychloroquine doesn't work, and it has a side effect profile to die for. Hydroxy's been pouting in the corner because he knew I was going to bring up how he's kind of failed for coronavirus. But he gets out and out angry when I make bad jokes about his side effect profile.
I can't help it. It's not my fault.
Such a whiner sometimes. So that's it for a hydroxy. Ivermectin actually is a little bit different, a little bit more interesting, and I'm going to be finishing that up in the next video. This is a 2-part series, and that should be out very quick. I'm kind of doing them together, so stay tuned for that one. Stay safe, and thanks for watching. See ya.